4 in the morning, and the only light on Blackfoot Knob came from a single halogen lamp clamped to a drill rig that looked older than the man standing under it. Walt and Merrick had not slept in 31 hours. His flannel shirt was stiff with dried sweat and rock dust, and his hands, big hands, a rancher's hands, though he hadn't been much of a rancher in years, would not stop shaking as he held the aluminum core tray up to the light. Inside the tray lay 11 inches of gray-green rock, flecked with something that caught the lamp and threw it back in tiny, cold sparks. He had seen rock like this exactly once before, on a page in a report nobody in the state of Wyoming had cared to open in 40 years. "Come on," he whispered, though there was nobody left awake to hear him. Even Ronnie, the driller, had gone to sit in his truck and drink coffee out of a thermos, done pretending he believed in this. "Come on, you son of a gun. Tell me I didn't just put my wife's hip surgery into a hole in the ground for nothing." Behind him, down the slope, the lights of Chalk Ridge blinked in the dark. A town of 1,100 people, most of whom had, at one point in the last 6 months, told Walt Merrick to his face that he had lost his mind. He thought about the town meeting, 2 weeks earlier, Dale Osner's palm slamming flat on the folding table hard enough to knock over a styrofoam coffee cup. "You're gonna lose the ranch over a pile of dirt, Walt. You understand that? You understand what you're doing to Carol?" Walt closed his eyes now, standing on the hill that everyone in 3 counties called a joke, and thought, maybe he's right. Maybe I really did lose my mind. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the rock again. And for the first time in 6 months, he let himself smile. 6 months earlier, the auction had been held in the basement of the Chalk Ridge County Courthouse, a room that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, with folding chairs arranged in crooked rows for the dozen or so people who bothered to show up for a tax-delinquent land sale. Lot 14 came up around 11 in the morning. 40 acres of what the auction sheet politely called unimproved rangeland, and what everybody in the room simply called Blackfoot Knob, a low, ugly hill of gray rock and cracked earth on the north edge of town. Good for nothing but dirt bikes, illegal dumping, and the occasional teenager sneaking off with a six-pack. "Do I hear 5,000? The auctioneer said, already sounding bored. Walt raised his hand before he'd fully decided to. There was a pause. A few heads turned. Everett Bragg, who ran the hardware store and had known Walt since they were boys, laughed out loud, an actual bark of a laugh, quickly swallowed when Walt looked at him. "You serious, Walt?" Everett said. "I'm bidding," Walt said. "That's what serious looks like." Nobody else raised a hand. The gavel came down at $12,000, and just like that, Walt and Merrick owned the ugliest piece of land in the county. That evening, he told Carol over dinner. He'd rehearsed it in the truck on the way home, tried to find a way to say it that sounded less insane out loud than it had in his head. It didn't work. Carol set down her fork very carefully, the way she did when she was trying not to raise her voice. $12,000, she said. "Walt, that was the surgery money. I know what it was. Dr. Hensley said if we wait past spring, the joint deteriorates faster." He said, "I know what he said, Carol." Walt's voice cracked just slightly, and he hated himself for it. "I've got a plan. I need you to trust me on this one." Carol looked at him for a long moment, 34 years of marriage in that look, all the times he'd been right, and all the times he'd been catastrophically wrong. And then she picked her fork back up and said nothing else about it that night. Which was somehow worse than yelling. Word travels fast in a town of 1,100 people. By the next morning, half of Chalk Ridge knew that Walt Merrick had bought Blackfoot Knob, and by that afternoon, the jokes had already started. Somebody taped a hand-drawn, "For sale, great view of nothing," sign to the fence post at the base of the hill. The Chalk Ridge Facebook group, 600 and some members, more gossip than newspaper, filled up with comments about Walt finally cracking after the state let him go, about the ranch being next, about whether Carol ought to start looking into assisted living for him early. Walt didn't look at Facebook. Carol did, and stopped telling him what she read there. His daughter Renee drove up from Casper that weekend, ostensibly to help her mother can tomatoes, actually to find out if her father had finally lost it. She found him in the detached garage he called his office, a space that had once held a tractor, and now held a drafting table, 3 rock hammers, a rock saw, He'd bought second-hand from a geology department at a community college that was closing. And stacks of manila folders that smelled like a courthouse basement. Dad. Renee stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, 31 years old and still able to make herself sound exactly 15. Mom is losing her mind. What is all this? Walt didn't look up from the folder he was reading. Sit down, I'll show you. She sat, reluctantly, on an overturned bucket. Walt spread 3 things across the drafting table. First, a topographic map of Blackfoot Knob, with circles and notations in his own cramped handwriting. Second, a scuffed manila folder, its edges soft with age, stamped Wyoming Geological Survey, archived. Do not circulate across the top in red ink that had faded to rust. Third, a small plastic specimen bag containing a handful of dull, water-worn pebbles, each one no bigger than a pea. You remember I used to do field work for the state, Walt said, before the layoffs. I remember you got laid off and never really talked about why. Walt's jaw tightened just for a second and then he let it go. That's a conversation for another day. Look at these. He tapped the specimen bag. I found these in the creek bed that runs off the north side of the knob, 15 years ago, on state time doing a routine water survey nobody cared about. They're just rocks, Dad. They're indicator minerals. This one, he picked out a small, dark red stone with his thumb and forefinger, is a chrome pyrope garnet. This one's chromite. On their own, they don't mean much, but together in this concentration, in this drainage pattern. He set them back down. They only come from one kind of place, Renee, a Kimberlite pipe, deep volcanic rock that sometimes, not always, but sometimes carries diamonds up from 200 kilometers under the Earth's crust. Renee blinked. Diamonds. I'm not saying diamonds, Walt said quickly. I'm saying the possibility of diamonds. There's a difference, and everybody in this town is going to forget that difference the second the word leaves my mouth, which is why I haven't said it to anybody but you and your mother. Mom knows about the diamonds and she still let you spend the surgery money. Your mother, Walt said carefully, knows about the rocks. I don't know that she believes in the diamonds. I'm not sure I fully believe in the diamonds. I believe in the geology. He opened the archived folder next and turned it so Renee could see the cover sheet. A 1974 exploratory report filed by a company called Continental Basin Minerals. Surveying, among a dozen other sites across the state, a low-relief volcanic diatreme north of what was then a much smaller town called Chalk Ridge. They found the same indicator minerals I found 15 years before I found them, Walt said. Drilled 2 shallow test holes. Confirmed Kimberlite Breccia at 60 feet. And then he flipped to the final page, where a single paragraph sat below a stamp reading project discontinued. They just stopped. No explanation on paper. Company folded 8 years later. Report got boxed up and forgotten in the state archive, and everybody who might have remembered why they walked away is dead or gone. Renee was quiet for a moment, looking at the yellowed page. So why'd they stop if it looked promising? That, Walt said, is the only part of this whole thing I don't have an answer for yet, and it's the part that scares me the most. The loan officer at Chalk Ridge Community Bank was a polite young man named Tyler Voss, who had grown up 2 streets over from the Merricks and had once mowed their lawn for spending money. He did not enjoy the meeting any more than Walt did. Mr. Merrick, I want to help you, I really do, Tyler said, sliding the paperwork back across the desk with an apologetic wince. But I can't get a loan committee to approve $40,000 against unimproved land with no proven mineral value. If you had an actual assay, a certified report from a licensed geologist. I am a licensed geologist, Walt said. A report from someone other than the applicant, Tyler said gently. Walt sat with that for a moment, the old anger, the specific, 15-year-old anger about the state survey job, about being pushed out for asking the wrong questions at the wrong time, rising up in his chest like heat off a road. I understand, Walt said finally, and stood up, and left before he said something he'd regret to a boy who used to mow his lawn. That night, Carol found him at the kitchen table with the ranch's financial records spread out in front of him. The same records they'd built a marriage and a family and 30 years of quiet, unremarkable stability around. Don't, she said, before he could speak. Whatever you're about to ask, Walt, just don't. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. He looked up at her. I'm selling the cattle, all but the 6 breeding cows. And I'm putting your father's truck up as collateral against the drilling contract. Carol sat down slowly across from him. For a long moment she didn't say anything at all, and Walt braced himself for the fight he knew he deserved. Instead, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. 34 years, she said quietly, and I have never once seen you this certain about anything. Not the wedding, not the kids, not the ranch. Her eyes were wet, but her voice held steady. I'm scared to death, Walt Merrick. I want you to know that. But I trust you more than I'm scared. Do the truck. Do the cattle, just don't you dare be wrong about this. 3 weeks later, a battered drill rig operated by a wiry, weathered contractor named Ronnie Castellan rattled up the dirt track to Blackfoot Knob. And half the town came out to the county road just to watch, the way people slowed down to look at a car wreck. Dale Osner did not think of himself as a villain. He thought of himself as the only sane man left in his wife's family. He'd married into the Merricks 26 years ago, Carol's younger sister, Denise, and in that time he'd watched Walt go from a respected state geologist to a man forced into early retirement under circumstances nobody would fully explain to a rancher who spent more time reading old survey reports than tending fence line. Dale ran the feed store. He sat on the county council. He believed, with the stubborn sincerity of a man who had built his own modest life on caution and hard work, that Walt Merrick was about to drag his sister-in-law into bankruptcy chasing a fantasy. So when Ronnie Castellano's drilling supply order, casing pipe, mud additives, a replacement hydraulic hose, got mysteriously delayed at the regional distributor in Casper, Dale told himself it wasn't sabotage. It was a phone call. A friendly word to an old friend who owed him a favor, suggesting that maybe there was no rush on Walt Merrick's order, that maybe a little delay would give the family time to talk some sense into him before more money went into the ground. It cost Walt 3 weeks. 3 weeks of the rig sitting idle on the hill while the banknote ticked forward and Ronnie's daily rate accrued anyway, because a stopped contract still had to be paid. 3 weeks of Everett Bragg making comments at the hardware store about Merrick's monument to nothing, sitting up there rusting. 3 weeks of Carol not sleeping. Walt found out about the delay's real cause almost by accident, overhearing Ronnie on the phone with the Casper distributor, Ronnie's voice going flat and confused. Dale said, "What now?" "Dale Osner told you to sit on it." Walt didn't confront Dale right away. He sat with it for 2 days, turning it over, trying to decide if this was betrayal or something closer to love wearing an ugly disguise. In the end, he drove to the feed store on a Tuesday afternoon and found Dale behind the counter, counting the till. "You held up my supply order," Walt said, no greeting. Dale's hand stopped moving on the cash drawer, but he didn't look up right away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ronnie does. Casper does. Everybody does, Dale, except apparently the one man who's supposed to be family." Dale finally met his eyes, and there was no shame in his face, only a kind of tired, righteous exhaustion. "You want to know why? Because Denise cried on my shoulder for an hour last week talking about her sister, Walt. About Carol putting off a surgery she needs. About you two eating into your retirement over garnets you found in a creek bed 20 years ago. I did what I thought was right. I'm sorry it cost you time. I'm not sorry I did it." "That wasn't your call to make." "Somebody had to make it," Dale said, "because you sure weren't going to." Walt left without another word because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't turn family into enemies for good. But driving home, hands tight on the wheel, he understood something new about the shape of this fight. It wasn't just the town against him. It was the people who loved him most, trying to save him from himself, and not knowing how to tell the difference between saving him and stopping him. The first core samples that came up clean, past the topsoil and the weathered cap rock, showed something Ronnie Castellano, 22 years in the drilling business, mostly water wells and the occasional coal test, had never personally seen come out of the ground. "That ain't like anything else up here," Ronnie said, turning the gray-green mottled rock over in gloved hands. "Look at that texture, like somebody mixed concrete with gravel and let it set weird." That's Breccia, Walt said, and his voice was doing something strange, something between a laugh and a held breath. Volcanic Breccia, fragmented rock blasted up from depth and re-cemented. Ronnie, that's the signature. That's exactly what the 74 report described at 60 feet. He looked at the depth gauge. We're at 58. Neither of them said the word diamond out loud. It felt in that moment too dangerous to say, like naming a thing might scare it back into the ground. That night still buzzing, unable to sleep. Walt did something he'd been putting off for 6 months out of something like fear. He called directory assistance and tracked down a phone number for Harold Prout, the retired state geologist, who'd authored a footnote reference to the old Continental Basin Minerals Survey. A man Walt vaguely remembered meeting once decades ago at a conference in Cheyenne. Harold Prout was 83 years old and living in an assisted care facility in Rock Springs, and it took him a full minute on the phone to place who Walt was and what he was asking about. Blackfoot knob, Harold said slowly, and Walt could hear the old man settling deeper into a chair, the creak of it audible over the line. Lord, nobody's asked me about that in 40 years. I bought the site, Mr. Prout. I'm drilling it now. We hit Kimberlite Breccia this morning. There was a long silence on the line. I always wondered if somebody would, Harold said finally. I'll tell you something I never put in any official report, son, because I was young and scared of losing my job, and by the time I wasn't scared anymore, nobody was asking. Continental Basin didn't walk away from that site because the geology looked bad. The geology looked good. Better than good. Then why'd they stop? Money and a lawsuit, Harold said. There was a labor dispute at their flagship operation up in the Powder River Basin, a bad one. A man died in a shaft collapse, and the company was hemorrhaging cash on litigation and settlements. Blackfoot Knob was a small, unproven satellite prospect 1,000 miles from their main operation. When the accountants came looking for something to cut, an exploratory site with promising rock but no confirmed diamond content was the easiest thing on the books to walk away from. It wasn't science that killed that project, Walt. It was a balance sheet and a dead man in a mine shaft that had nothing to do with your hill at all. Walt sat with the phone against his ear for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the dark shape of Blackfoot Knob against the stars, thinking about how close the truth had come to dying with an old man in a care facility that nobody thought to call. I always felt bad, Harold said quietly. Felt like we left something unfinished up there. Wrote a little note to myself in the file, hoping somebody smarter or braver than me would come back to it someday. A dry, papery chuckle. Took 40 years, but I suppose you'll do. Confirmation of Kimberlite was not the same as confirmation of diamonds, and Walt knew it even as the whole town, having caught wind of Ronnie's loose talk at the diner, began to treat the question with a fevered new interest that felt worse, somehow, than the Mockery had. Because now there was money on the line for everyone's imagination, and everyone had an opinion about how Walt should spend the last of his. The account that held what remained of the cattle sale and the truck collateral loan had, by the second week of the deeper drilling program, fallen below $4,000. Not enough to fund the specialized diamond recovery equipment Walt knew he'd need to properly sample the ore body, a dense media separation rig that would cost more to rent for 2 weeks than the entire original land purchase. Carol's surgery, already pushed twice, had a hard deadline now from Dr. Hensley. Wait past the fall, and the joint damage would likely require a more invasive procedure with a longer recovery. Walt stood in the kitchen with both numbers in front of him, the drilling budget and the surgery bill, and understood, for the first time since the courthouse basement, real fear. Not the manageable fear of being laughed at. The fear of having been right about the rock and still losing everything anyway, because being right and having money were not the same thing. It was Dale, of all people, who showed up at the ranch house that week, not with an apology, but with an offer that felt, to Walt, worse than the sabotage had. I talked to some people, Dale said, standing awkwardly on the porch, not quite meeting Carol's eyes. There's a firm out of Denver does mineral rights acquisitions. They'll pay you $80,000 for the claim as is, no strings before you spend one more dime you don't have. Walt, that's real money. That's Carol's surgery, your truck back, the cattle herd rebuilt. You walk away clean. You went behind my back to shop my land to a buyer, Walt said, very quietly. I went behind your back to save you, Dale shot back, and for the first time his voice cracked with something that wasn't just stubbornness. It was fear, real fear for people he loved. I watched you lose your job 15 years ago over some fight nobody ever explained to the rest of us. And I have spent every year since then waiting for you to rebuild something solid, and now you're about to lose it all again. And this time you're taking Carol down with you. I can't watch that happen twice, Walt, I won't. Walt looked at his brother-in-law for a long moment, and beneath the anger, something in him softened, just slightly, an understanding, maybe for the first time, that Dale's opposition had never been about doubting the rock. It had been about a decade and a half of watching a man he cared about get broken by a system and being terrified of watching it happen again. I appreciate you, Walt said finally. I do, but I need you to trust me one more time. Just one more time, Dale. That's all I'm asking. Dale shook his head slowly, but he didn't push the Denver offer again. He drove away, and Walt stood alone on the porch a long while, $80,000 and a clean exit sitting in his mind like a door he'd chosen, on purpose, to leave shut. That night he sold the last 6 breeding cows. The core sample that came up at 140 feet, 3 days later, looked at first glance like nothing special. Another length of the same mottled gray-green Breccia they'd been pulling for a week. It was Ronnie who saw it first, catching the light wrong on the wet, freshly cut face of the core, a single sharp point of brilliance no bigger than a grain of sand, embedded in the rock matrix. Walt. Ronnie's voice had gone strange. Walt, get over here. Walt crossed the platform in 3 long strides and Ronnie handed him the field loop, a 10-power jeweler's magnifier Walt had carried in his jacket pocket for 6 months without needing it once. He bent over the core sample, adjusted the loop, held his breath, through the lens. Magnified and catching the low morning light, the grain resolved into an octahedral crystal, a shape unmistakable to anyone who had spent a career studying rock, translucent, faintly blue-white. Embedded whole and untouched in the volcanic matrix that had carried it up from 200 kilometers below the surface of the earth. Walt did not shout. He did not punch the air or laugh, or do any of the things he might have imagined in some private daydream that this moment would look like. He sat down, right there on the drilling platform in the dust, and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook silently for almost a full minute, while Ronnie stood over him not knowing whether to say something or leave him be. 15 years, Walt finally said into his hands, muffled. 15 years I've carried this around, Ronnie. Everybody thought I was crazy. My own family thought I was crazy, and I knew. I knew the whole time, and I still spent 15 years not being sure enough to say it out loud. You're sure now, Ronnie said quietly. Walt lifted his head, eyes red, and looked down the hill at the town of Chalk Ridge spread out below in the morning light. The feed store, the diner, the bank that had refused him alone, the courthouse basement, where a dozen bored strangers had watched him buy a joke. Carol needs to hear this from me before anybody else does, Walt said, standing, brushing the dust off his knees with hands that were, for once, perfectly steady. Before this whole town finds out. He didn't make it in time. By the time he got down the hill, half of Chalk Ridge already knew. Ronnie's assistant had made one phone call to his girlfriend, and by noon the Facebook group that had mocked Walt for 6 months had transformed overnight into something breathless and reverent, full of people, suddenly remembering that they'd always believed in him actually. Deep down, Carol was standing in the kitchen when he walked in, and one look at his face told her everything before he said a word. She didn't ask if it was real. She didn't ask how much. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her husband and held on, both of them shaking. 34 years and $12,000 and a mortgaged truck all converging finally into something that felt, for one unguarded moment, like pure and uncomplicated joy. It would not stay uncomplicated for long. The lawyer arrived 4 days later, driving a rental car too clean for the dirt roads around Chalk Ridge, and introduced himself on the porch as Preston Kell, representing a company called Sable Ridge Resources. He did not offer congratulations. Mr. Merrick, I'll get straight to it, Kell said, opening a leather folio on the porch railing without being invited to. My client has reason to believe there's an unresolved mineral rights complication on the parcel you're currently developing. Specifically, an easement filed in 1998, attached to an adjoining property once owned by a Wallace Osner, your late father-in-law, I believe, granting subsurface mineral access rights across the boundary line, which by our reading extends into the Blackfoot Knob parcel you purchased at auction. Walt felt the floor of the morning tilt slightly under him. That's not possible. I did a title search before the auction. Clean title. The auction cleared tax liens, Kell said, not unkindly, in the practiced tone of a man who delivered ruinous news for a living. It didn't clear pre-existing easements filed against the adjoining parcel, which under Wyoming statute can, in certain configurations, run with the land regardless of subsequent tax sale. My client acquired the rights to that 1998 easement 2 years ago as part of an unrelated portfolio purchase, with no idea at the time what it might sit adjacent to. He almost smiled. Until last week. Whose signature is on that easement? Walt asked, though some cold, sinking part of him already suspected the answer. Kell turned the folio around. Dale Osner, as executor of the Wallace Osner estate, 1998. Walt stared at the photocopied signature, his brother-in-law's handwriting, 26 years younger, on a document neither of them had likely thought about in a decade. "We're not looking for a fight, Mr. Merrick," Kell said, closing the folio. "My client is prepared to offer a very generous joint development agreement, 60% of net proceeds to Sable Ridge, 40% to you, given the strength of our claim. I'd urge you to consult counsel before you decide anything. But I'll be honest with you, since you seem like a straightforward man. Our legal position is strong. Very strong. You may want to think hard about 40% of something, rather than gambling everything on 100% of a lawsuit you can't afford to fight." He left a business card on the porch railing and drove away, and Walt stood there for a long time, the diamond that should have been the end of his story suddenly feeling like the beginning of a much more dangerous one. Dale showed up that evening before Walt had even called him, because Denise had already heard through her sister and driven straight to the feed store to confront her husband. He stood in Walt's kitchen looking like a man who had aged 5 years since breakfast. "I forgot," Dale said, before Walt could say anything at all. "I swear to you, Walt, I completely forgot that easement existed. It was routine paperwork when your father-in-law's estate settled. Some old irrigation-adjacent rights language a lawyer told us to file to keep a water access dispute quiet with the neighboring parcel. I signed 40 pages that week. I didn't think about mineral rights because there were no minerals anybody cared about in 1998. It was dirt, Walt. It was worthless dirt." "It's not worthless dirt anymore," Walt said quietly. "And apparently your signature is sitting on a document that could hand 60% of it to a company neither of us have ever heard of." Dale sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the same table where, 6 months earlier, he'd slammed his palm down and called Walt a fool. "I did this," Dale said. "I spent 6 months trying to protect you from losing everything, and it turns out the thing that might actually cost you everything is something I signed, 26 years ago, without reading it carefully enough." He looked up and his eyes were wet in a way Walt had never seen from him before. "Let me fix it. Please, Walt. Let me be the one who fixes this." They worked through the night, Dale driving to the county records office the moment it opened, pulling every filing connected to the Wallace Osner estate, cross-referencing dates against Wyoming statutory requirements for easement renewal. Walt called a mineral rights attorney in Casper, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who agreed to take the case for a contingency fee once she heard the outline of the claim. It was Dale at nearly 2 in the morning, hunched over a card table in Walt's garage, surrounded by photocopies who found it. A clause buried in the original 1998 filing requiring the easement holder to record a renewal affidavit with the county every 15 years to maintain active status against a bona fide third-party purchaser. Sable Ridge's predecessor company had acquired the rights in 2011. The 15-year renewal deadline had passed 11 months earlier, quietly, unnoticed by anyone, and had never been filed. "It lapsed," Dale said, staring at the page like it might disappear if he blinked. "Walt, it lapsed." Their claim is dead. Priya Anand confirmed it 2 days later after a full review. The easement, whatever its original intent, had expired under its own terms before Sable Ridge Resources had ever laid eyes on Blackfoot Knob. Their legal position, so strong, so confidently presented by a lawyer in a car too clean for dirt roads, collapsed the moment someone bothered to read the fine print Dale himself had signed without reading, a quarter-century earlier. The county hearing to formally quiet title against Sable Ridge's claim was held in the same courthouse basement where Walt had bought Blackfoot Knob for $12,000, and this time there were no folding chairs left empty. Everett Bragg was there, Tyler Voss from the bank. Half the Facebook group that had spent 6 months calling Walt Merrick a fool now sat shoulder to shoulder, in a basement room that smelled the same as it always had, watching Priya Anand lay out in careful, unhurried detail the lapsed renewal and the dead claim. While Preston Kell sat stone-faced beside a Sable Ridge executive, who had flown in from Denver for a fight that ended in the end, in 11 quiet minutes. The judge, a tired county magistrate named Ruiz who had presided over more disputes about fence lines than diamond pipes, ruled clean title in Walt's favor before lunch. Outside on the courthouse steps, Dale found Walt in the small crowd of well-wishers and held out his hand, formal, almost shy. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give big enough," Dale said, "for the delay, for trying to sell you out to Denver. For the easement I never should have signed." Walt looked at his brother-in-law's outstretched hand for a moment, then ignored it and pulled him into a hug instead, rough and brief, the way men who don't usually hug each other do it. "You spent 6 months trying to save me from ruin," Walt said, "and then one night trying to save me from your own mistake. I'll take a man who fights that hard for family over one who never doubted me at all." Carol's surgery happened 3 weeks later, in Casper, fully paid, fully scheduled, no more postponements. She walked without pain for the first time in 2 years, and cried about it in a way that had nothing to do with rock or money at all. The geological survey that followed, conducted by an independent firm Walt insisted on hiring, rather than accepting any single company's word, confirmed what Harold Prout's 40-year-old instinct and Walt's 15 years of quiet certainty had always pointed toward: a Kimberlite pipe of significant scale, with early indicator sampling suggesting reserves in the multi-billion-ton range across the full ore body, one of the largest verified diamond-bearing formations discovered in the continental United States in decades. Walt didn't sell out to a conglomerate. He partnered on his own terms at a controlling stake, with a mid-sized mining operation willing to let a 58-year-old former state geologist have real say in how his own hill got developed. On a cool morning in early autumn, Walt walked the ridge of Blackfoot Knob with Renee beside him, the drill rigs quiet for a Sunday, the whole valley spread out gold and brown below them. "You always said you didn't fully believe in the diamonds," Renee said. "Even after the first strike, what did you believe in?" Walt was quiet for a moment, looking down at the ground that had cost him a marriage's worth of trust and a decade and a half of being laughed at. "The rock," he said finally. "I believed in the rock. Everything else, the town, the money, whether anybody thought I was crazy, none of that ever changed what was actually down there. I just had to be stubborn enough and broke enough and scared enough to go find out." He looked out at the valley, at the town that had mocked him, and then in the space of a single afternoon forgotten it ever had. "I'm setting up a scholarship," he said. "Geology for kids out of Chalk Ridge High. So the next person who sees something nobody else believes has got a little more than a mortgaged pickup truck to work with." Renee smiled, and together they watched the sun climb fully over the hill that the whole town had once called a total waste of money.